So going into the design for manufacture section, there are some fundamentals in design for manufacture. There's good courses, good guidelines out there. To touch on the overall basics, you want to make sure it can be manufactured with ease. You want to make sure your product is economical. You want to reduce the amount of parts in there where possible. Also, where possible, to use standardized components that you can buy off the shelf instead of putting up the expense of manufacturing things individually. And also where you can, avoiding separate fasteners. Looking at the design for manufacture from a process point of view first, I love this example by Mo Salim. There's a YouTube clip of it. If you haven't seen it, it's brilliant to watch. And this just emphasizes how things that require quality require time. You can force a graphics designer to draw a picture in 1 minute, but the quality from the 10 minutes will be considerably less. And again, the 12 seconds, it's a brilliant visual example. And with that, when it comes to the product development process, there are steps in the design process which can't be compressed into tighter time scales. There are some things that take the time they take. But in saying that, there are things that we can do to get activities running concurrently. For example, engaging your suppliers early in your development process. If you get an idea of roughly what sort of manufacturing process you're going to use at the end of your concept phase, the one that you're looking at putting into development, and have a chat with key suppliers in terms of, is this manufacturable, and what are some of the key criteria you need to include in your design to make sure it's easy to manufacture. One example I have of this is where we managed to save time on a project by a concept that had been put forward to a client, a beautiful concept with a curved extrusion, and at the same time as presenting, I managed to get an extrusion manufacturer in to check whether this was actually achievable. Fortunately, before we did the full presentation, we found out that the extrusion, because we were bending along the longer dimension and a particular radius, it was not feasible to manufacture. So fortunately, before we moved into the next development phase, we already knew that the development had to use an extrusion with a machine part in order to achieve the same look. This is just one example of how, by bringing in your manufacturer early, you can stop development mistakes that can be quite costly for time down the track. Another example of a process design for manufacture consideration is the quality versus costing in your prototyping or initial batch phase. So once you've developed your product and you want to do your full working prototype, works like prototype, before putting it into your batch manufacture. In an ideal world, you would get your manufacturer to provide you a sample of what you're going to be having. However, in the real world, that's just not always possible. So I've got an example where we selected a sheet metal provider in Canada because they were consistently fantastic on quality, fantastic on price, and their tolerances and their processes were spot on for what we needed for this application. It was a medical research instrument which required bent sheet metal and a whole bunch of welded on studs and nuts so that you could very quickly put on a valve, a spectrometer, attach all of your pneumatics in the assembly process fairly quickly without having to put in every individual screw and nut, which you can imagine over 200 of these individual components can take quite a lot of time. Because of the process that we were using and the supplier that we wanted to use, it being a long lead time to order these products from the actual manufacturer, we chose a local supplier to prototype this for us. And they did a brilliant job in terms of what they could achieve. However, the level of quality was not the same as the manufacturer that we would be ordering from in the long term. So we found with this particular product that the tolerances between the studs weren't quite right. So we couldn't fit our valves onto these. Now, this is a big problem. So we had to go back to machining holes in the sheet metal and attaching individually. For the prototype, this was acceptable, and it showed us exactly how things would work for the assembly of the production, but that's somewhere where you do have to balance up the compromise on time to get your prototype versus quality of product that you've got. Another one where the quality and time challenge came up was we had a medical device company who were putting a component into injection molding manufacture. And the tooling engineers, as soon as they saw the drawing for this, said, whilst in theory this particular corner, in theory, should be manufacturable, we have concerns because it's actually very difficult to achieve. Now, The client went ahead with this because this was a design which had already started going through clinical trials. There was quite a lot of work behind it, and redesigning this component would mean a significant delay in their launch to market, which for this particular product was very critical. So instead of redesigning the product, they decided to try and alter the tool. So the initial production pilot tooling was done in the UK by a UK manufacturer who took the tool back, spark eroded away the area, re-welded it, spark eroded it back to the corner that it needed to be, and it was trialled again in the factory. And we kept on having problems where the particular edge would not fill, the mould just would not fill with different temperatures, different machines and different materials. Everything had been tried. Eventually, the local tooling manufacturer put a vent at the end of that, which was not ideal because when you overfill slightly, it creates a bit of flash on that corner. However, we worked out that we could get a portion of the product manufactured in order to meet their deadlines. It did mean that we had an incredibly high reject rate. So the cost of this particular component went up very high because of the high reject rate. However, they were able to meet their end timescales by doing that approach. The scale-up tooling, which they got manufactured in Germany, fortunately worked a lot better. It still had a fairly high reject rate compared to what you'd normally expect in the injection moulding environment, but it was much more acceptable in terms of the cost loss to the client. In terms of looking at it from the product point of view, you want to keep the cost down on the product, but not with compromising the quality. Here we have an example whereby you can significantly take out the cost of this by taking out the springs, the lever arm, and just replacing it with a flexi rod. However, whilst it may take the cost down to a third, it's also taking your sales price down to a third of what the original product was. So it's about keeping the original vision and checking in that you're meeting the quality and the user requirements that you initially started off with. There are some basic guidelines also which we can see being used for design for manufacture on the slide. One is the sheet metal component at the base here, which is it's laser cut, then the holes are punched, and then it's bent. Now with sheet metal, you've got particular guidelines that you need to stick to. For example, the radius of the corner needs to be 6 times the thickness of the metal. The diameter of the hole needs to be twice the thickness of the metal. Just standard guidelines. However, you do still find that sometimes the guidelines don't work when you actually put it into production. Another example is for injection moulding. When you're looking at the time for the cycle of the product that's being produced, that stacked up time on cycle in terms of how long it takes the mould to fill, the component to be made, ejected out, and then start the cycle again, the longer you put onto that, the more expensive that product is going to be, and the stacked up cost at the end will be. Something as simple as in an injection moulded clip where you might have sharp corners, if you change that into a radius, it helps bring down the tooling cost because instead of doing a spark eroded sharp corner additional process, the tooling manufacturer can CNC that out with the appropriate tool. And then in the injection moulding process, you can shave off some quite critical time in terms of mould flow, bringing your cycle time down, bringing your product cost down overall.